Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the psychology of retirement, presented by Dr. John Nicoletti. My name is Chiquette Tara, and I am one of your field education reps here at FPPA. Now, a little bit about Dr. Nicoletti. Dr. Nicoletti received his PhD in counseling psychology from Colorado State University in 1972. Then he co-founded, along with his wife, Lottie Flatter, Nicoletti Flatter Associates in 1976. He has since established himself as a national expert in police psychology, violence risk assessment, workplace and school violence prevention, as well as crisis intervention and trauma recovery. Dr. Nicoletti has been asked to take part in several high-profile investigations, including the Columbine High School, Aurora Theater, and STEM school shootings. And now, Dr. John Nicoletti.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. So what I'm going to try and do in the time we have is just kind of take you through the field of preparing for and surviving and thriving in retirement. Be looking at kind of the psychological issues that you'll be facing, and then also be talking about some ways to mitigate and navigate through retirement. We're going to allow some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to mark those down as we go through. I want to begin by providing you with a metric. This is the metric we use to, there we go. This is the metric we use to evaluate how somebody's doing or the problems they're having, and it's something you can use on your own. I created an acronym called FITS, and what it stands for is frequency, intensity, time, and seepage. Now let me talk a little bit about each of those. You can use this model for a physical symptom, you can use it for a psychological symptom, and you can even use it for a trauma symptom. Frequency refers to how often you have the symptom. So for example, headaches. You can literally count how often you have a migraine or a headache. Same thing with psychological symptoms. Say you're having what we call panic attacks. You can literally count how often you're having a panic attack. Trauma, the same thing. You can evaluate how often you're having nightmares or intrusions or flashbacks. The next level is intensity, which refers to severity of your symptom. It's not as objective as frequency, it's a little more subjective. What do I mean there? So a headache. You know, the typical way people tell you to evaluate your symptoms is on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high. That's not as meaningful with psychological issues. So what we'd like you to do is evaluate symbolically. For example, headache. Say your headache's low, like a 1 or 2. How would you describe that? So rather than giving a number, we'd want a description. Typical one we'd get is, well, it's like somebody's tapping inside my head. Now, if you move to the higher end, like a 9, the way you describe that, it would be like somebody running a jackhammer inside your head or a vice around your head. The next one is time, which refers to duration. And this is an objective measure. You can literally look at a clock and tell how long you're having a symptom. How long do your headaches last? If you have a panic attack, how long does it last? Or if you're having an intrusion from a trauma, how long does it stay with you? Now, the last one, seepage, is an interesting one. It really refers to interference. If the severity of your symptoms start to increase, your ability to control and monitor that goes down, And what happens is you start doing what we call seeping or leaking of your symptoms. And what that means is other people start seeing the problems you're having. And usually what happens is we get into denial and don't want to admit it. How do you know if you're seeping? It's real simple. If your family or friends or coworkers come up to you and say, "Are you okay? You seem like something's bothering you," or "What's going on?" If you get those questions, what they're really saying is you're starting to seep. So you can use this model to evaluate your problems. You can also use it to evaluate your improvement. Now, one thing to keep in mind with improvement is you're not going to improve on all 4 areas at the same time. If as long as you're improving on one of those 4, you're going in the right direction. So let's move into aging. I want to kind of hit on 3 areas: cognitive, physiological, and psychological. Cognitive is our brain processing. What do we know about our brain processing information as we age? Now, without dementia or Alzheimer's, you should be able to prevent a lot of degradation, but you got to work at it. The brain needs constant stimulation. So one of the things you need to look at in retirement, or if you're about to retire, is how are you going to keep your brain stimulated? Now, you need to realize people do things that stimulate the brain, but there's what's called habituation. For example, say you do Sudoku all the time. Now that's stimulating the brain, but if all you're doing is doing Sudoku, then the brain habituates and it doesn't stimulate it as much. So you need to cross and do other activities. The one they've shown that really keeps the brain stimulated is learning a new language. That seems to activate a lot of stuff going on in there. And I'll get into more detail on these things as we go through. Physiological, we look at 3 things: cardiovascular, skeletal, and muscular. Heart, and you know that with all the advances and stuff, you should be able to prevent cardiovascular disease. Now, that being said, you may have to have stents or other things like that, but cardiac rehab is very, very powerful and very effective. Skeletal is the main problem. If we look at a car as an analogy, and you look at your engine like your heart, basically the engine's designed to go 100,000 miles, but the suspension system's only designed to go 40,000. So with skeletal, you'll find that starts to give out. Unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do to prevent it. There's a lot we can do to deteriorate it. What do I mean by that? Some of you may notice your knees going out or your hips and stuff like that. That's your skeletal system. Muscular, we tend to lose a percentage every 10 years of muscular mass. That can be counteracted by weight-bearing exercises and stretching. So you need to look at 2 things there. You need to look at weight-bearing exercises, lifting weights, those type of things, as well as flexibility. You know, we require more stretching and flexibility the older we get. Then the next area, which I'm going to spend most of the time, is psychological. So first area I want you to think about is, what are your reasons and purpose of retirement? Now, if you're planning retirement, you can think about that. Or if you're in retirement, you need to kind of establish, what were your reasons for retiring? And what was the purpose of retiring? Now that sounds like, well, what does that really do? It really relates to quality of life. The other one that ties into it is this. What are your reasons for working in your career in police and fire? What got you in there? Now, why is that important? Because the things that got you in the career will follow you when you leave the career. They're needs. And you got to look at, how am I going to meet the needs now that I'm not a cop or a firefighter. And what we look at, three things. This is the essence of who we are. You know, you hear people saying personality, good personality, bad personality, grumpy. What is personality? It's really made up of three variables. Call it the three-legged stool: control, identity, and self-esteem. Now, you need to know all of these start at birth. Control is your ability to manipulate your environment yourself. Those of you who have children, you bring your little one home from the hospital. What does she or he actually have control over? And I know some of you are thinking everything. Actually, no. The only thing they have control over when they come home is crying. Then as they start to develop, they move into what we call experimental physics. You probably remember that, those of you that are parents. You have your child in a high chair and you have a spoon on the little tray. If your child's in experimental physics, they'll drop the spoon. And you'll come along and pick it up, and they'll drop it again. They're really trying to understand gravity, because that's an abstract. Now, where parents don't realize, that's a short-lived phase. They quickly moved into experimental psychology. What is experimental psychology? They drop the spoon and you pick it up. And so what the connection they're making is, hey, I dropped the spoon and this tall person comes over and grabs it. That's kind of neat. Let me see what I can make that tall person do. So that's experimental psychology. Now, as you grow, you get more and more control. Then you get in your career in law enforcement or firefighting, and you have a lot of control. Then you leave it. Guess what? Still have a need for control. How are you going to meet it? Second area is a really important one: identity. Or, in law enforcement, it's called a jacket. Your identity is formed at birth by your parents, and you formed your children's identity. Sometimes that can be a positive experience. Sometimes it can be a negative experience. Parents don't realize that what sounds good as an identity for a little child may not work out when they get older. So a lot of people try and spend their life getting rid of their identity. Now, how do you know what identity you gave to your children? It's real simple. You just finish the sentence. Like if you have a boy, he is such a, or if you have a girl, she is such a. Whatever you fill in the blank, that's the identity. He's a hard worker. She's such a nice person. He's a good eater. Sounds good. Think of the adult version of that. What's the adult version of he's a good eater? What's the adult version of she's so nice? Person turns into kind of a wimp and is always trying to please people and never takes stuff for themselves. So you got to be careful of your identity. Now, when you leave law enforcement, you lose that identity. A song I always tell people to listen to before they're ready to retire is a Fleetwood Mac song called Players Only Love You When You're Playing. When you're at the department, you're getting ready to retire, your coworkers will say, yeah, drop on by, man. Not so much. You leave and you come back and people say, who's that old person hanging out here? So the key thing to resiliency is you got to have multiple identities. Now, by multiple identities, I don't mean in the morning you're Tom, in the afternoon you're Susan. Identity: you're a cop, you're a firefighter, you're a coach, you're a spouse, you're a parent. What we find is the more identities an individual has, the more resilient they are. And you know that. You've probably seen folks you've worked with who their whole identity was being a cop or firefighter, and then they leave the job and they forgot to develop an identity. Does a number on them. Self-esteem, that's an interesting concept. People talk about self-esteem, good self-esteem, bad self-esteem, but very few people know what it is. Self-esteem is actually the self-talk you have inside you. I'm smart, I'm strong, I'm this, I'm that, I'm ugly. That's your self-esteem. It's formed at birth. Soon as you bring your child home, you start developing their self-esteem. Now you're probably saying, how do you do that? Because the child has no control. The big thing that starts self-esteem at birth is facial expressions. That's kind of universal. In other words, you bring your little one home from the hospital, you're working graves, you're tired, they're crying, you go over, you pick them up and you have a frown. No matter what culture a kid is from, they can identify smiles and frowns and all those type of things. So that's kind of the message you're giving them. Whereas if you pick up your little one and you're smiling, that's another message. Now, as the child starts to get control, their self-esteem is affected by what they can accomplish. And you remember this with your little ones when they start walking and they get to the other point, they're proud of themselves. And if you as a parent comes along and reinforces, that helps them. So by the time you reach adulthood, your self-esteem has stabilized. And you could actually rate it on a scale from 1 to 100, with 100 being a good self-esteem. But it's like the stock market, it can be affected on a short-term basis by what happens. For example, say some of you listening to this webinar, you're single and you got in a dating service. And you meet somebody and you're going out on a date with them. You're really excited to be with that person. And your self-esteem is right about 80, pretty good self-esteem. So you're walking along with this person and you're not paying attention. You walk into a pillar, knock yourself out, fall down on the ground, wet your pants. That's going to knock your self-esteem down a little bit. But eventually it'll come back up. Now, you can change somebody's self-esteem over time, and you know this. You see this person, they get in a relationship, and the person they're in the relationship with is always putting them down, calling them names. And eventually their self-esteem goes from an 80 to 75 and keeps dropping. And then it reaches a point, and you've seen this, you've probably said to yourself, why would that person stay in the relationship? If your self-esteem gets so low, you don't have the energy or the drive to get out of the relationship. So that's the triad. When you leave your job, you got to look at how do you meet the needs for all three of those. So let's begin to break that down a little bit. These are some of the typical things folks get into your career for. Now keep in mind, law enforcement and firefighting is a career, it's not a job. That's a big difference when you retire. How do you know if you're in a career or a job? By if somebody asks you, what do you do? You know, if you're a firefighter, you say, I'm a firefighter. If you say you're a cop, you say you're a police officer. That tells you you're in a career. If you're working at Walmart and somebody comes up and says, what do? You don't hear that person saying, I'm a Walmarter. You'll hear them say, well, I work at Walmart. That tells you it's a job. So look at all those attractions, pay and benefits, helping others, camaraderie, chasing the jazz, having groupies. I mean, that's kind of changing with the negative attitudes towards cops now. Riding in fast cars or big trucks, going toward danger, having authority. Now, why is that important? Because the things that attracted you to the job many years ago when you got on, those are still attractions for you. So look at those things and look at how am I going to meet those needs once I leave law enforcement. And there are a lot of healthy ways to meet a fair amount of those. Some of them can be not so healthy or neurotic, like if you have a strong need for authority, now you're not a cop no more. How do you meet that needs? And that's where you see people becoming the president of the homeowners association and walking up and down the neighborhood and measuring your grass in your mailbox and all those type of things, trying to channel it that way. So think about how you're going to meet the needs. Now you're going to retire. What are you going to lose? Might lose money, might lose identity, definitely identity, sense of belonging. Daily purpose can be lost, camaraderie. A big one, front row seats to the greatest show on earth. If you're used to the jazz and you retire, something big's going down, all you can do is read about it. And again, you lose power. Plus, there are plenty of other things you lose. What do you gain? You gain freedom. And that in itself, tied with time, can be a stressor. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. You may be able to get money, may be able to have lack of stress. So those are the positives. Phases of retirement. First phase of retirement is always this. Wow, I'm out of here. I'm glad to be gone with all the stuff going down nowadays. It's called the honeymoon phase. And that can be short-lived, or it actually can last for a while. And what's the next phase? Call it the reality phase. Oh my God. Or you can maybe say, oh shit, I'm finally out of there. Then you start questioning yourself. Is this what retirement's really about? Is this what I have to do with the rest of my life? Now, if it's pre-planned, it's exciting. But if you forgot to do that identity and planning, then it becomes a burden for you. Sink or swim. You can accept, adapt, and readjust. Or you don't accept, you don't adapt, and you're never going to readjust. I'm sure all of you know people who retired, and they're retired and they're very bitter. And they can't seem to shake that. Or they're still focusing on how they got screwed working for the department. That's going to take its toll. So let's begin to look at some of the negative symptoms. If you don't have a purpose, you're going to engage in aimless wandering. And that's going to drive your spouse nuts. For example, you retire and your spouse is either working or they were used to lifestyle with you being gone a lot. Now you're home. What you'll start to do is follow them around the house. So there you are following them, and you got a couple dogs, so the three of you are following your spouse around the house. Now, what people don't realize, when you retire, you have a reverse time management dilemma. What do I mean by that? So we have 168 hours in a week. You retire. All of a sudden, you got 40 extra hours. What are you going to do with those? And I'll show you how to kind of monitor that in a couple more slides. Loss of identity and status. And sometimes you lose your focus. Then your comfort zone starts to shrink. Now, what's a comfort zone? We all have it. It's different sizes for all of us. Everything inside our comfort zone, we don't mind doing. We like to do. We enjoy it. Everything outside of our comfort zone, we avoid. Or if we do it, it creates a lot of anxiety. Now, just by the fact you all were in this career, you probably have pretty big comfort zones. So you like doing your job, you like to ski, you like to bungee jump and race motorcycles and kayak and climb and all sorts of things. Over time, our comfort zone is like our muscles. If you don't work out, your muscles will do what we call atrophy. Your comfort zone, if you don't push it, it'll start to shrink on its own without trauma or anything like that. And I bet you some of you know what I'm talking about. Those of you who had parents or grandparents used to be fairly active folks. And then they retired. They stopped doing things. And pretty soon you're trying to get them to come and visit you, do things, but they won't. So one of the things when you retire, you got to definitely make sure you're not letting your comfort zone shrink. Deterioration of your physical and mental health. Again, that doesn't have to happen. But what gets tied into that is feeling old. Now, feeling old can have a certain amount of reality, you know, with your muscles being, or your joints being sore, but it's also a psychological thing. One of the things we see, and you've probably seen people like that, their only outfit is a pair of sweats, or the worst was, you know, coveralls, onesies, where they just wear the same thing over and over. If you dress old, you're going to feel old. The other thing that happens is if you are constantly doing activities where you're comparing yourself to your younger self, that will add to feeling old. In other words, you used to lift weights. Now you're getting old, losing some muscle mass, some joints. You can no longer bench press 300 pounds. So if everything you do is an old activity, you're always going to seem like you're deteriorating. Geez, I can no longer run this fast. I can no longer lift this. I can no longer drive that far. So one of the things that helps in terms of what we call resiliency is once you retire, start new activities. The reason you want to do that is when you start a new activity, as you progress, you'll actually improve. Whereas if you're staying with your old activity, the best you can do is try and maintain, but over time, you're going to start to deteriorate. So it's really important you think about new things. And it could be physical, it could be recreational, it could be a variety of things. But once you start something, you're going to improve on it. The other part is feeling like an outsider. Again, going back to Fleetwood Mac, players only love you when you're playing. Especially if you spent your whole life just associating with people in your career. You kept away from the other folks. Now, you don't have that base. So you're going to feel like you don't belong. Then the deadly triad. You really want to avoid this if you can. Hopelessness, helplessness, and desperation. That's the deadly rabbit hole. So you really want to be careful of going down that. So what do you need to do? Basically, you need to reinvent yourself. And it's pretty easy. Number one, seeking out new directions, new endeavors, and new challenges. The brain and the psyche likes to have challenge. They always say adventure starts at the edge of your comfort zone. So you want to constantly be pushing that. Now, here's kind of a time analysis sheet. Here's all the things we spend our time doing in the course of a week. So one of the things I want you to do, if you're interested, is right now, if you're still working, look at how you spend your time. Now, personal maintenance and hygiene is taking care of yourself, shaving, showering. General maintenance is doing stuff around the house, working on your car. Immediate family responsibilities, you know what that is, extended family. Some of you have parents you have to take care of, and you may still have kids. Recreational. Employment, that's your 40 hours. Spiritual. So now some of the things you can combine. You know, you can do two things. You can spend time with your family while you're still working at things around the house as a family. So that's what's called ultimate time management. Now, you retire. What are you going to do with those 40 hours? Where are you going to put them? Some of you may try and get new employment. This can actually cause problems in a relationship. What do I mean by that? Two things. Number one, you retired and you're thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to take all my 40 hours and use it on recreational. Going to get a boat, going to do all these, get all these toys. And your spouse is saying, nope, you're going to spend it repairing the house. Now, the other thing that happens, relationships don't realize this. It's a two-ended kind of sword. One is every relationship has a minimal amount of time you need to be together. And you've probably experienced that when you all were busy and dealing with kids, you're not able to spend quality time. So every relationship has a minimum amount. But what people don't realize, generally until they retire, is you also have a maximum amount of time you can tolerate each other. And if you reach that, your body does an interesting thing. It switches from focusing on macro stimuli to focusing on micro stimuli. What do I mean by that? Macro stimuli would be me talking. Micro stimuli would be any background noises you're hearing when I'm talking. So, example, you and your significant other, maybe with the kids, you're having breakfast together. And this particular morning, you all are eating cornflakes, but you're on tilt. What'll happen is you'll start to hear one of your family members crunch the cornflakes and gulp the milk. And to you, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. That's all you can hear. Or the kids are getting on your nerve. That's the microstimuli. Or the person you sleep with, when they exhale, their nose whistles, or they snore. That's all you can focus on. Then what happens? All problems start out as situational adjustments. Then if you don't handle it, we add another word. You never want this word added to your problems. That word is disorder. For example, with trauma, we like to keep it at post-traumatic stress. Now, if you don't handle it, we add that word post-traumatic stress disorder. Now you got a problem. Panic attacks. You want to leave it there. If you add panic disorders, now you got a problem. So we kind of create our own brand of misery. You're on tilt. You're getting irritated with everything. Any of you ever lose your temper for no reason with your family members or your children? How do you all feel after that? You probably feel bad, and you probably added a new variable called guilt. And guilt is a gift that keeps on giving. So you need to be real sensitive to micro, minimum and maximum amount of times so you don't get that micro stimulation. So these are kind of, everybody knows that. I'm not going to spend much time. Eating habits, exercise habits, drinking and smoking and sleeping. Those are the key variables. You know, if you don't know about that at this point in your life, you're never going to know about it. Expand your comfort zone. You can renew old activities and endeavors, but better, develop new activities. Constantly push yourself. Now, not so much where you're creating anxiety, more where you're kind of creating more excitement. You need to do that on a regular basis. Now, one of the things we added that we're seeing is a lot of folks, when you retire, you carry the trauma with you. People think when you leave the job, all those ghosts aren't going to be with you. The reality is, no, they'll come with you. So we kind of added a section on dealing with trauma. Now, to deal with trauma, you got to understand it. How do we activate that part of our brain? You have to be involved in an event where there's death or injury. Either you're directly involved, like an officer-involved shooting, or a fire, or you're a responder to somebody else's tragedy. That's the only way you can develop PTS and PTSD. In other words, you're not going to get PTSD because the Broncos didn't go to the Super Bowl. You're just being a whiner. So that activates that part of the brain. Everything with trauma starts out with two things, too much and too ugly. Depending on the type of trauma you've dealt with throughout your career, we add a few other variables. Too much, too ugly, too soon. They used to think that was the only way you could get PTSD. Too much, too ugly, too soon. You're involved in combat. You're involved in a shooting. You're involved in a real intense fire. So that's what it was like for a number of years. But then they started seeing people who didn't have those events, and they developed PTS or PTSD. Because when you respond to somebody else's tragedy, somebody else's trauma, somebody else's loss, you'll take a bit of that with you. Trauma and stress are both contagious. So you can develop severe PTSD just from vicarious trauma. How do you get that? Too much, too ugly, too long. That's where you've been doing your job too long, or you had a special assignment, like in law enforcement, you were assigned to homicides or pornography or child sexual assaults. Body and the brain reaches what we call circuit overload. I can't take this anymore. Too much, too ugly, too similar. You respond to an event that was similar to something else you've had to respond to, or closer to home. You respond to an event that's personal. You had a child the same age as the fatality, or you respond to suicide and you had somebody in your family commit suicide. As soon as it's familiar to it, it opens up that part of the brain. The other one we're calling extreme events. Too much, too ugly, too different. You're responding to something that you've never had a framework for. In your career, you all had to respond to a lot of death and accidents and things. Those are called critical incidents. And your brain had a profile for it. Once in a while, you'll respond to something, there's the death and injury, but it's so far out, you can't make sense of it. We're seeing that with those of you that had to respond to mass shooting events. You don't have a roadmap for it. So when you don't have a roadmap, you can't make sense of it. What does trauma do to us? It gets inside of our system. What it does, when we PTSD, what is it? Oops, sorry. You've seen folks who have PTSD. When you go through a trauma, you have it in the conscious part of your brain initially. Then what you want to do is move it from point A to point B, the memory center. Now, what happens with people who have PTSD is they didn't move it in a timely manner, because between the conscious part of your brain and the memory center, there's some gates, not literally. And these gates start closing over time. And if you don't get that trauma moved to the memory center, it's too late. So like when I work with people who truly have PTSD, I'm not going to cure them. Best I can do is teach them how to live with all the symptoms. Now, what people don't realize, for you all, majority of you probably have post-traumatic stress. In other words, you didn't develop PTSD, but you developed post-traumatic stress. What does that mean? You move the trauma to the memory center, but it goes to a very specific part of the brain that I call the Book of the Dead. And those of you that have been around for a while, you may have a lot of chapters in the Book of the Dead. Now, one of the things people don't realize, and sometimes it hits you when you retire, one of the things we've never been able to do from a psychological standpoint is prevent activation of the Book of the Dead. So what that means throughout the course of your life while you're working, and even when you retire, you will have triggering events that will wake up a chapter in the Book of the Dead. And what will happen is it'll bring those ghosts from the memory center to your conscious part of your brain. Now, that's kind of disturbing. And how do you know you've had that event? If you ever say to yourself, why is this coming up now? I thought I dealt with that. Why is this bothering me now? That tells you that you activated a chapter in the Book of the Dead. Now, while that ghost is haunting you, it's unsettling. But the good news is if you put it in the Book of the Dead, you can always get it back, or we can help you get it back. So it always goes back to the Book of the Dead. But you need to realize in retirement, those things can be activated. Now, going back, the deadly duo in trauma are two things: intrusions and flashbacks. Intrusions are ghosts that kind of stay with you on a regular basis. And they can be cognitive, where you keep thinking about an event, you're replaying it in your head over and over. They can be visual, where you keep seeing the traumatic event. They can be auditory, where you keep hearing sound of gunfire, or fire, or screams. They can be smells, you know that way. Smell a dead body and you leave it and it's still with you. And then you touch too. You can have intrusions from touching. You're trying to pull a person out of a burning automobile and their skin comes off. You'll still feel that sensation. Or it can be something as small as, say, some of you don't like spiders, and you walk in a room, you go under a spider web, spider drops on you, you see that sucker on your shoulder, you're trying to get it off, but it's clinging to you. Finally, you knock it off. What do you still feel wandering through your body? You'll feel the spider. Now, we break intrusions into three areas, and I call them walkers because everybody's into Game of Thrones and zombies. Your intrusions can be three categories: day walkers, night walkers, and dream walkers. Day walkers are intrusions that come while you're working, while you're busy. Night walkers, they occur while you're at home with your family. Dream walkers literally occur while you're asleep. They'll come in two categories: nightmares and night terrors. How do you differentiate? Nightmares are easy. If you wake up and you remember what you just had a dream about and you say, yuck, that's a bad dream, that's a nightmare. Night terrors are a little more problematic and a little more difficult to get rid of. Night terrors. You wake up and literally you're feeling the sensation of terror. You may be having a panic attack. Your heart's racing. You may have been sweating a lot. The person you sleep with will recognize you're having it, but you have no recollection of it. Now, two offshoots of the night terrors can be sleepwalking and sleep talking. They're a little harder for us to treat unless they come at a regular basis. What do I mean? Say you have your night terror about 2 a.m. What you can do, and I don't know all the neurology of it, you can set your alarm clock for 1:45. And what it seems to do is reboot the brain, and it skips the night terror. But if they're not that predictable, then unfortunately, we can't control them. So in terms of controlling things, we want you to look at what sensory modality is being impacted, because if the trauma is coming through your brain, cognitive, we handle it a little differently than if it's coming through your eyes or your ears. And the time of day it happens. Now, those are intrusions. The other thing are flashbacks. What are flashbacks? Oops, sorry, flashbacks. You're fine, and all of a sudden, a trigger event occurs. It could be visual. You see something, and it brings it all up. Could be a sound, gunfire, cars backfiring. Or it could be smells. Those are the toughest ones. If you have traumatized at your olfactory, we have a hard time dealing with that. And it can last a lifetime. What do I mean? Anybody on this webinar ever had what we call food poisoning? We got sick on food. Did you ever notice that you couldn't eat that food? Or if you smelled it, you'd have a flashback. The flashback at that point in time is the nausea. That's the flashback. Now, the interesting thing about flashbacks, people don't realize, you will now, is we actually have flashbacks on a regular basis throughout the course of a week. We just don't realize it. Because most flashbacks are going to be either neutral or positive. What do I mean? Anybody ever smell something from your childhood you really like Christmas trees or baking or the smell of, fresh pine? Takes you back. You ever hear a song from high school that you really like? What does it do to you? Takes you back. The other thing trauma does is it shatters our assumptions about the world. We have a lot of those shattered. When Columbine came, we all had an assumption that when we send our kids to school in the morning, they'll come back alive at the end of the day. With Columbine and STEM, some of those, it didn't happen. So now when your assumptions are shattered about the world, you got to figure a way to rebuild that. Now, you can engage in denial, which is not necessarily the best thing to do. Denial, like, oh, we saw that after Columbine. It's an isolated incident. It'll never happen again. It's probably not a good way. You can engage in avoidance. Working with some of the survivors from the Aurora Theater, they said they're never going back to a movie theater again because that assumption of movie theaters being safe got shattered. And, we're coming on 9 years since that, and there are people who were there that have not been back to a movie theater. So avoidance is one way, but it's not the best. The worst is what we call meltdown. That's where you send your kids to school and you're not sure they're coming back alive at the end of the day, so you sit and worry about it. So what we want to do there is what's called new normal. How has things changed for you going to a movie theater? You may come carrying your weapon, you may look around, but the new normal is the best way to deal with it. And like I mentioned, it shatters our comfort zone. And we deviate from baseline. What do I mean by that? What were you like before you handled a traumatic event? What do you like after? What were you like before you got into law enforcement or firefighting? What do you look like at the end now? What's that like? That's deviating from baseline. So what do we do with trauma? We want to move it from a thought to memory, keeping in mind that the walkers can always be woken up. You want to rebuild your assumptions about the world. And you want to restore your comfort zone so you have more freedom to do things. So how do we do that? First one's very important. Folks in law enforcement and fire careers tend to separate physical from psychological. It's a big mistake. I can tell how well somebody's dealing with trauma by words I hear coming out of their mouth. In other words, you're having something bother you from a traumatic standpoint, and you say to yourself, this shouldn't be bothering me. I've dealt with worse. That's getting into denial. You would never do that with a physical symptom. In other words, if you cut your leg open, your quad's bleeding all over the place, you would never say to yourself, oh, I shouldn't be bleeding. Because if you did say that, you'd bleed out and then you die. Guess what? Psychologically, the same thing works. You can psychologically bleed out. Now, you don't literally die, but you psychically die. The other one tells me they're going down a rabbit hole is something's bothering them. People say, why don't you go talk to somebody? And they say, well, I should be able to handle this on my own. Again, in your wildest dreams, you never do that with a physical symptom. In other words, you found out you got cardiovascular disease, and you got to have triple bypass. How many of you are going to get on YouTube and pull up the YouTube video on how to do your own bypass surgery? You know, it looks pretty easy. I need a friend to help me crack my chest open, but from there, you know, we just tie off a few things. You never do that. Rigid people say I should be able to handle it on my own. Resilient people say I'm going to do whatever it takes. Consider trauma to be like a sunburn. You know, if you're out in the sun, you wouldn't keep going. Same thing with trauma. Look at your modalities individually. Then reestablish balance and equilibrium. You know, when you work in your career, you lose that. So now when you're retired, try and get balance back in your life. Then purge it. That's the key variable. PTSD, trauma is part of the stress continuum in that it's contagious. But there are many, many ways to handle stress. None of them work for trauma. In other words, you can go to the gym, you can go to movies, you can do all sorts of things. Trauma, the only way you get it to the Book of the Dead is I call purging. There's only 3 ways you can do it. Talking about it, writing about it, or with kids, we can have them paint and draw and things like that. As an adult, that won't work. So that's why, you know, we have mandatory debriefings. Now, you may not be able to talk to people because, you know, you don't want to burden your family or you don't have anybody to talk to, or you're kind of introverted. We found that you can move trauma to the memory center by writing about it. And when I say writing about it, I literally mean writing, not typing. And one thing with trauma, once you write it, don't read it for a long time, because when you read it, you put it back in. And striving for cognitive closure. How do you make sense of what just happened in your career? Brain needs some type of closure. Some last things. Stay connected. Humans need to be connected. Friends, family, community. Now, current events, we're kind of waffling on that because current events are all negative. You know, you turn on the TV and you learn how many people got positive tests, how many people are hospitalized, how many people are on ventilators, and how many people died, how many people hate law enforcement. So that we may have to begin to eliminate. Then create new missions and purposes for you and your family. Some things to look at. If you haven't already, you should be planning ahead 3 years. I think, Shaquette's on time. I think we need to open it up for questions. I saw you pop up, so. Yeah, I got a few minutes. I went over a little bit. Any questions?
I'm not rushing you by any means. I just was preparing.
No, thanks for doing that. Any questions?
Yeah, you were recently covering the topic on PTSD. Are there any percentages that you could share of the number of first responders that end up needing some sort of assistance and help with that? And is there sort of a parameter of how many treatments are typical?
Okay, good question. What you need to look at is traumas like cement. When you first pour it, it's movable. Then it begins to harden. Pretty soon it becomes a hard block. So the sooner you begin to process trauma, the better it is. I mean, all of you, the folks in these careers, have PTS, post-traumatic stress. That just comes with the territory. But you can prevent it from turning into PTSD by looking at how do I move it to kind of the memory center. And you can do it on your own by debriefing with your friends or your family, or going in and using peer support or psychological services. One of the things we've started with Denver is we actually have peer support programs for retirees. And we're also kind of trying to set up where we can see the retirees in counseling too. So those are some things to look at. So I guess the answer to your question is the sooner the better. Now, how do you know if you've moved it to the Book of the Dead? This is where you got to be honest with yourself. You don't want to, you can run a con on your family, your coworkers, you can run a con on me, but don't run on yourself. So if you moved the trauma to the Book of the Dead and it's not haunting, then make sure you leave it there. One of the mistakes people make, especially when they retire, those of you retired, somebody may come up and say, hey, what's the most traumatic thing you ever had to deal with? And you decide to tell that person about this really bad thing. That can be very dangerous, because if you go knock on the door of the Book of the Dead, what are you risking? You're risking waking up that particular ghost. But one of the things we see which becomes problematic is you can do what's called linkage, where you wake up one chapter, which wakes up another, then you got all of them doing so. The rule of thumb is if you don't want to talk about something because it's too painful, it's too hurtful, and it's too emotional, you need to talk about it. If you don't want to talk about something because it's in the Book of the Dead and you want to keep it there, then yeah, you don't have to. So that's kind of a way to look at it. If you're being haunted, you need to talk about it.
Thank you. So can you speak just a little bit about the changing of going out of retirement and perhaps into another career? Some of those pitfalls that one might encounter, it might be less important, less, meaningful. How would one approach that?
Good question. So what you want to do there is, a lot of people, they retire, but they get into another career. If the career you're getting into is something you kind of started before you got into retirement, like real estate or things like that, that can be very positive. The thing you don't want to do is, like for a cop, go from being, a cop who has a lot of seniority, a lot of power, to all of a sudden being a security guard and checking doors. That's going to do a number on your self-esteem. So if you're going to get in a career, do it either where you're advancing from what you had when you were in this career, or it's totally different and you don't have to compare yourself.
Great. And I think for our very last question, would you suggest, if one was thinking about downsizing, would that be done after retirement, or perhaps it's looked at before retiring? Is that a better approach, or is it just an individual basis?
Well, the first thing you want to do is, and you want to start thinking about this before you retire. One of the mistakes people make when they retire is they make drastic changes and they're not prepared for it. We'll see, people say, well, I'm going to Arizona. They're talking, I'm going to move to Arizona. And you say, well, have you ever been in hot weather? How do you know you're going to like it? So you need to think about these things. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what's the purpose of downsizing? Is it to say that I'm getting ready to die and I don't need all this stuff, or what's the purpose of downsizing? So always ask that question. What am I trying to accomplish by downsizing? Then the next thing you do is to fantasize and visualize being downsized. And then actually, go to Arizona before you decide to move in a smaller place in Arizona, and stay there for a week and see what it's like.
Great.
Because you can always go there, but if you go there and you throw away everything, and that's when it's, oh my God, what did I just do?
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for all this great information and suggestions and preparedness for all of us to give some thought to. Thank you all.
Thank you all.